all weak. I must have burned out the batteries. All right. We have been looking at Re and the religion of light as a means to get at the principles of hierarchy through Egyptian mythology. To do that, we've been doing it very much the way Egyptian mythology is set up itself. Egyptian mythology is set up with lots of trinities. And each of these trinities brings out a different side of the members of the trinities. And we began looking at trinities of Re, and we looked first at, I guess we're right. Oh, no, yeah, okay. Re, Khepra, and Tem. And all three were seen as different faces of Re. And we looked at associations of Re with Might and Tehuti. And we saw this as the power, wisdom, love, wisdom, and reason. And we spent a lot of time looking at Re, Hathor, and not much in the association with Heru, which had to do with the divine creation. And we looked a lot at the spiritual feminine and at the material feminine. Now we're going to look at the last one that we're going to look at, and we're going to start moving into hierarchy itself. We're going to look at the three-part of Re, Shu, and Tefnut, which we talked about a long time ago when we first started talking about Re. We started talking about the two versions of the creation myths, which were very strangely but alike, but antecedent to the creation myths of the Bible. So we began talking about that. This trinity, or three-pout, forms the crown of the classical pout of Heliopolis. In just a second, we'll look a little bit at some of those pouts. It's actually not Heliopolis. If you're in the Egyptian, it's called Anu, which is pretty close to where Cairo is today. It's the place that most people have in mind when they think of Egypt at all. They think about temples with big obelisks in between, and then pillars with balls on the top of them, and winged balls, and halls plated with gold, and lettered in with lapis lazuli is what they use. Unfortunately, there was a very long history of Heliopolis, and it changed quite a bit. In fact, if you look at the various different pouts that Heliopolis produced at different times of history, you find the membership quite different. The only one that is common is the crown, is the only thing that is common to all versions of the various pouts of Heliopolis that have been found in records. That is Tem, which is, as we saw, is another name for Re, or Tem is Re in human manifestation, or a divine son, or a holy king, or something like that. Even Osiris isn't in all of the versions. Seb and Nut aren't in all of the versions. The only thing are Tem, Shu, and Tefnut. The Great Company formed the only 12 pout that is known in all of Egypt. There was the Great Company for the macrocosm, and then there was a company of 12 of the microcosm, which were human-like gods, and then there was another pout of 12 for the dead or for the underworld. The way we're going to look at this is we're going to put this together with what we did earlier. The first pout that we looked at, the pout of Hermopolis. We're going to connect the two together. And we don't want to make them that large, though. Oh, the board isn't big enough. I should have made it. I made it. Good evening. We could, if we wanted to, we could have put it as we put it. We put a half hour up here, an invisible half hour, and if we wanted to, we could put down here a newt, and this is the these 8, not the ray, although Ray was born from them, is the pout of Hermopolis. So we have
what's that word next to absolute?
Unmanifest, absolute unmanifest, or unmanifest absolute, either way, however you like it. This is the, you might say this is the pout of chaos, and this is the pout of cosmos. Because all of the pout of Hermopolis, all of the members represent various stages before manifest creation, before there was even spiritual light. The ray represents the sun as a spiritual light, whereas Tem represents it as a human or a materialized light, an external kind of light. And so the pout of Nu, or the stages of Nu, represent the stages of preparation or elemental stages of creativity before there is any organization. The classical pout of Heliopolis represents, to the best of my knowledge, the best statement of the way they saw the organization of the spiritual worlds and the divinities in manifest creation and what came out of them. It's interesting to note, and it's again one of those irrational things that doesn't make sense, but doesn't have to make sense, that Nut is a member of both pouts and is part of the unmanifest as well as part of the manifest. So, we are now ready to start looking at manifest hierarchy by looking at Re, Shu, and Tefnut, Look at that, we're through 2 pages of notes already. Maybe we aren't going to be here for more than 90 minutes. The first thing that we note in all of this is that in all of the manifest, Re is known in the face of Tem rather than as Re per se, which is Re in, or the spiritual center, or the spiritual sun in manifestation. And if you remember that Tem was the divinity that was associated with the sunset at Mount Manu, or the downside slope of Mount Manu. The Khepera, on the other hand, represented the fresh creative power at the base of Mount Baku, that is the rising sun. And that Ra, or Amun-Ra, or Heru, represented the high soaring hawk at the acme of its power, and that Temu represented the humanized quality. So remember a long time ago, I think it was 2 years ago, we talked about Isis and Osiris, and we said that the river Nile was such that if you went downstream, you became human, which is to become Tem-like, and if you went upstream, you became divine, and you used the energy of Khepera, and that Khepera quality represented divine creativity in its freshest, most bursting state. If in the physical body, if the spine represents the river Nile, the turning of the creative energy downward had to do, if we remember, that Manu and Tem represented the ancestor, the Adam of all humans, the first divine king coming into a human-like state, that the going downstream of the creative energy into the area of the creative organs represented the fall into humanity, and the turning back upward of the same energy into the point in the skull that looks like the heart of the beetle. If you remember, Khepera was the beetle god, that the turning upward to the point in the skull represented a divine type of quality, a awakening to true spiritual being. So when we're looking at our classical offspring palette here, we're looking at the universe and human beings in generation. And this is where the quality of Re, which represents the creative spiritual sun, is distributed, going all the way back to what we talked about, Dionysus being ripped apart, or Osiris being ripped apart and the parts being cast everywhere. It was best told in the myth of Dionysus, where there was a distribution of the principles so that it was distributed, that the central sun that Re represented was found in each and every being, but that there was also a vertical distribution so that the various qualities of Re vertically were manifest as different principles in the different worlds and the different divinities. So this is what we're going to be talking about now. All right. We looked at the creation myth, which was very like the Bible myth. And if you will remember from that, that out of the stages of darkness, Nu represented the darkest of the dark. It represented the inert, watery mass that was in the abyss. And that represented everything solidified in an absolute state. And you might say that that represented the midnight to the visual eye of spiritual creation. and that as things came toward dawn, the changing of light in the atmosphere represented pre-manifest states in chaos of the creative activity that eventually gave birth to Ray in a burst of light. Now, if you remember, when Ray was born, or as Ray was being born out of the inert watery mass of Nu, he masturbated. And he masturbated as he was falling out, and as he was falling out, he swallowed his masturbation. And it fell into his mouth, and some versions said he spit out Shu, and some versions said that he spit out Tefnut. There's no common view about this. All involved in the complexities of this, that as well as swallowing his masturbation, there was a creative love-making act with his own double. And before this occurred, Ray could not be seen, nor could Ray see. And when Shu and Tefnut were born, Ray could see, becoming both the vehicle of light and the seer within that light. But that what happened was that the first act of Shu and Tefnut was to close Ray up in bushes that had been put out for adornment, and those bushes obscured Ray, so that at the same time that Ray was first capable of being seen, he was immediately covered up by that which could see him. It's a paradox that as an act of auto-generation, with himself as his double, he brought forth the two. The one brought forth the two, and the emanation of the two both facilitated vision and obscured it. This is a very, very deep principle. It's behind everything that is in hierarchy itself and behind the principle of manifestation. In the Rosicrucian philosophy, we are taught that in this earth period, the sun could not become a sun until it had precipitated or thrown off from within itself everything that was not sun-like, and that the process of throwing off those things brought the sun to a center of light and of brilliance instead of being located all over as it was before. And at the same time, it led to the externalization and objectification that could be seen by the newly formed direct light of the sun. This is exceptionally important. It works in everything in our spiritual lives. It works in everything in developing a hierarchy within our own being. That when we throw off from ourselves, or when we create from ourselves what we are not, we know more what we are. And that in the process of forming this dichotomy of the known and the unknown, or the knower and the things that are known, that by externalizing things, wanting to know from within ourselves what something means, when we externalize it and examine it, that very act of externalization and examination is what concentrates and distills the light of spiritual intelligence within our own being. So the more we can delineate, and the more discreetly we can delineate our character into all of the parts so that they function autonomously within the oneness of our being, the more clearly we see what we are in spirit, and the more we can eventually incorporate the externalizations or the things that are becoming into our total being as an integral oneness, which could not be without such a separation or without such a distillation. And so the process then of externalization produces a natural hierarchy. I don't know if we'll get a chance next year to look at it or not, but we may want to look at Baudet's law, to where the planets are externalized from the sun and how those distances represent harmonics, and that the quality of the planet is determined by what harmonic it is from the central source of power, and what it is an externalization of within the divine consciousness. But the principle is an extremely important principle. It is, you might say, in some ways at the heart of all occult experience, which means hidden experience, which means scorpionic and eighth house experience. And Scorpio and the eighth house represent life and death matters. And it represents matters of hidden, taking things from the hidden and making them manifest, or taking things from the manifest and hiding them. It not only has to do with life and death, but it has to do with the direct association and connection between creation and wasting. Sort of like the excrement or the excreting or externalizing is like the wasting process, which leads to fertility of the life process. And so this is all tied together. The more we can objectively externalize something from ourselves, the more we develop the creative power in us. And in fact, I don't believe it is possible to even externalize anything without being creative about it. I'm one of those people that believes in primitive art a lot, because if you start the whole process of externalization in order to find yourself or know yourself in that process, you develop artistic abilities to do what you have to do or what you want to do, and you don't. The scorpionic dissatisfaction is there because you can never be satisfied with your artistic creation until you externalize all of those imperfects from inside of yourself. This principle also says that the spirit cannot truly come into its own, into its spiritual light, except by elimination, except by generating or throwing off things that are not illumined. And to recognize that we don't know something is the process of developing spiritual light. There is a school of spiritual philosophy that eschews new experience and eschews the external world altogether as being ugly and evil, and that kind of philosophy is bound to result in an effete spirituality, because it is only when we have this interaction with the unknown that the spiritual light can really be unfolded. In the same way that we can't live on yesterday's sun today, we can only live on the sun right now. If we only try to transcend and live in spiritual glories, we'll be living in something that can only be kept alive by new external creation. And that, this is saying that the spirit needs matter as much as matter needs spirit. It's also saying, very fundamentally, that the spiritual light is lit by giving, or by giving off from itself. That there is no such thing as a spiritual light that just is there in an eternal sense, illumining for no good but its own, or no end other than just the light. It's saying that the whole process of giving, even if that giving results in the condensation of light in the form of matter, or even if it results in the so-called loss of light in what is called entropy, there is no light without giving. The objectivity of spiritual light, of spiritual vision, is bought through interactions with objects that are the consequence of ignorance, congealed ignorance or congealed illusion. It is in the process of an experiment or in the process of a creation that there is any interaction at all so that we can develop the objectivity of spirit. It's like saying the further apart we can set from ourselves what we don't know and examine it with a bird's eye view, the more we develop the objectivity and impersonality of the spiritual being by intimate association with personal objects. Okay, now, to look at it from the other point of view, the generations or the distributions, including ourselves, are obscured from the light by the same act. We only see reflections. We don't see the light itself. Even the way our eye works is a reflection. Even the way we apperceive the truth of the spiritual world is by reflecting our thought. Intuition is direct. With intuition, we become ray-like. But with the process of thought and with the process of perception, we're only dealing with reflections and we're bouncing things off. The obscuration by the bushes, which were meant for adornment, shows very beautifully that the world is imperfect as it is, the objectifications, all of what we would call the soul worlds, the desire world, the world of thought, the etheric realm, and the physical, are part of the creation. And it is a work of art, and it is very beautiful, but relative to the spiritual meaning of it, it's still an obscuration. And you might say, very literally, when people talk about working in the garden or working in the vineyard, all of us are landscapers. We're moving around the objects of a creative garden. You can see where my thoughts are going already at this time of the year, it's spring. So we've already looked a little bit at art as excrement, and so let's now start going into hierarchy. All right, so Ray became Ray by creating Shu and Tefnut, and through Shu and Tefnut, Ray came to know self. But in the process of creating Shu and Tefnut, Ray became Ray Tem, Ray in generation. Shu and Tefnut are always spoken of together. It's very rare that there is ever anything said about either one of them alone. We're going to find of all members of the Paut of Anu, Shu and Tefnut are both brother and sister and husband and wife. In Egypt, they had no nome of their own. They had no city of their own, though they had temples in quite a few cities. In fact, Shu and Tefnut are so closely united that they are even said to have shared the same soul. That is, they were really reflections of each other. From this, and we're going to see this quite a bit all the way through this, it isn't until we get to Greece, as we hope to get there next year, that we actually find true objectification and personification in discrete beings. Shu and Tefnut, because they're universal and all-pervasive, and they have no place of their own, are elemental. All of the Paut of Heliopolis, or the Paut of Anu, is elemental. When we think of earth or energy or love or any other general state, we're thinking about an elemental existence. We're talking about a realm, or we're talking about an element that runs through realms. When we talk about the elements, we normally talk about solids, liquids, gases, and energy, with earth, water, air, and fire. And so when we're thinking here of the Paut of Anu, and especially so with Shu and Tefnut, we are thinking of an atmosphere that has elemental qualities running through it. And this is a very extremely important concept to work with, because it fits us for the whole process of spiritual creativity in ourselves. There is a difference between a world of thought and thoughts. There is a difference between a world of emotion, feeling, and desire and individual desires. In the same way that there cannot be rain that precipitates out of an atmosphere unless that atmosphere exists and there is a consciousness in that atmosphere, thoughts cannot be developed without being aware of the palette or of the substance or of the constant ringing of thoughts. So that this is important for our spiritual consciousness to be aware of the atmospheres or the various levels of atmosphere that we exist in, because it is from the atmosphere that we develop our own vehicle of relating to that atmosphere and precipitate minutiae or objectifications from that atmosphere. And it's really a beautiful way that the Egyptians do this. So the atmospheres that runs the series of atmospheres, or the levels of atmosphere, or the realms of atmosphere, or the elements that run through the Paut of Anu, go through many transformations through the different levels of the hierarchy of the Paut. And collectively, they form something that we've been talking about all along, They form what is the spirit-matter pole. That is a continuum. And this is again, man is associated with matter, spirit is associated with divinity. This is the spirit-matter pole of manifest existence. Everything condenses or everything evaporates along this pole. That things go from a more gross to a more rare state and back and forth. Let's pass on that. The spirit-matter pole is part of a unity. And that unity is, as we recall, manifest within potentials. And those potentials exist and not exist in the absolute. It is in the trying to understand what the potentials point to in the absolute that the states of existence in the spirit-matter pole exist for. And it is so integral that it cannot be separated. When it says Shu and Tefnut share a common soul, this means to say that you can't look at one without the other. The potential that spirit lives in is time. The potential that matter lives in is space. We have no way of measuring time without taking into account space. And we have no way of measuring space without taking into account time. We say, how long does it take? It takes 3 days, or it takes 3 years. And days and years are measured by bodies of matter passing through what is called a potential of space. If we say how large is the Earth, we say it is as large as it takes going at moving something or motivating something for such and such length of time is how long or how large something is in matter. And so what we're trying to understand is a unity, because that in which we all exist and not exist is a unity. And we can only understand that unity by the apparent dualities and divisions, which is why all occult philosophy, which attempts through the intellect, which is at the center of the spirit-matter pole, to understand and to objectively know everything, is always a dualistic philosophy. It's never a unity, because in a unity you can't do anything. We'll let that to the mystics. They try to seek the unity in which nothing can be spoken, or of which nothing can be spoken. In order to understand a form like an automobile, we have to understand the life that works within it. In order to understand the principle of a life, we look at the form that it manifests. That represents its philosophy of doing what it does. So we're looking at this dualism, and we're looking at it as a atmosphere. In this atmosphere, we have Shu, who represents air. And we have Tefnut, which represents moisture. But it's a special kind of moisture. The name Tefnut literally means spit, which means it is precipitate moisture. And this is a compound, because not only does Shu represent air, but it represents air and heat together. It's hot and dry. And moisture not only represents moist, but it represents cool. Not really cold, but cool. And so they represent the atmosphere throughout all being in an elemental sense of that which precipitates and that which levitates. And Shu represented hot, dry, withering air. So we actually have sort of a four-element system right here. They were both said to be born out of the same egg as Re. And you might say then that Re represents the unity and that which constantly seeks heat and dryness and all of the objectivity that comes with that is Shu. And that which goes down into earth and precipitates is represented by Tefnut. Now, this brings out a really, really interesting thing. I couldn't find anything anywhere in any of the books, and so I'm given liberty then. And when you give me liberty, it's dangerous. I really go for a good time. If you remember, when Kepera came out of the Tuat, out of the darkness, and burst up the side of Mount Baku, that he came out of the Tuat bent over backwards. Temu, on the other hand, who is going downward, is most likely in a fetal position, bent inward. And so that everything, this is even in plain old physical space, everything that is balled up in space spins. And the more tightly it's balled, the more tightly it spins. Only it spins in two different directions. And so that the fetal type of consciousness spins one way, and it spins everything into matter, whereas the bending over backwards spins the other way and spins things back into space. This clearly answers the question of how Re, as Re Temu, would swallow his own masturbation because he was bent together in a fetal position. Now, he fell out of the inert watery mass of the abyss of Nu. So he was then fetal. He made an end of. Now, this becomes very interesting in terms of the spirit-matter pole. We know, in a simple sense, that humans and plants are inverted. That we get our intelligence from above, plants get their intelligence from below. We take in oxygen and give off carbon dioxide. Plants take in carbon dioxide and give off oxygen. We turn our generative organs down. Plants turn their generative organs up. These represent sort of like in a linear fashion the difference between a fetal ray versus a bent over backwards ray. And there are examples in the spiritual literature of trees that are upside down trees that have their roots in heaven versus trees that have their roots in the underworld. If, the origin of Tefnut is unambiguous. It's always she is spit out. Though in some places it's said that she is emitted. But Shu, in some cases, is spit out, but the word is most frequently used emitted. Some people thought or think that the emission was urination, that he was pissed out. I tend to think something different. Well, let's look at Tefnut is also called the goddess of gentle rain. Shu, on the other hand, is more ambiguous. The emitted could mean belched. It could mean breathed, because in some places Shu is called the breath of God. But I choose to think of it that Shu was probably farted. There's a reason for it. If Khepera represents bent over backwards, always looking outward and forward, it would represent a divinity with the head upward. If Tem, or Temu, represents man being precipitated into matter, or God being precipitated into matter, the head would be downward. And the emission of hot air would have to go upward. And that sounds very much to me like a roaring fart. And it goes along very well with the whole. It gives new meaning to the whole idea of in the beginning was the Word, doesn't it? In fact, I have run into people. I knew a man that used to spend a lot of his time and his creative energy dispersing clouds for you. He would give demonstration of his powers. He'd ask you which cloud you wanted dispersed, and he would disperse it. And he spent a lot of time eating foods that produced gas because he got somehow in his mind that the spinal gas was literally a gas. And he thought that things like belching and farting, thinking that the alimentary canal was like a second spine, that if you have a lot of gas in you, that sympathized with the spinal gas, and that you you would be more likely to be exciting the spinal gas. But all right. So literally then, it would mean parched, withered, and dry. We would see then Temu as the upside down god. And this is really interesting because Shu held up all of the heavens and had 4 pillars to do so. But Shu also took serpents, and these serpents he froze, and he stood them up, and they became the ladder of souls. And these serpents were like the spinal gas serpents rising upward, and that the attainment of the different steps of the ladder meant the unfoldment of various different forces that are associated in the physical body with centers in the cerebrospinal nervous system, and that when you came to a certain degree of consciousness or awaked to this ability or that, it was like taking a step on a ladder. So it was literally the two serpents frozen in place and were tied together literally with the spinal gas. It's not clear to me whether, this is another thing we'll come into in a little bit when we deal with something else, it's not clear to me whether Shu holds up the heavens or whether Shu holds down the earth. I tend to think that most commentators in modern times think about it the wrong way. They think that the heavens are lifted up into the air over the earth, and that is wrong thinking, because if you've ever tried to do any concentration or tried to condense anything, it takes a continuous and sustained effort to solidify something, because the natural tendency is for things to evaporate and break up without the concentrated power of spirit. And I think that Shu actually holds the earth down. So the light of Shu was the food of the deceased as they climbed the ladder of souls. Before we pass on, I want to talk a little bit about this. In this whole process of Ray being hidden behind the bushes after he has, in one way or another, emitted Shu and Tefnut from the swallowing of his own masturbation, something else takes place. A few drops from his penis fall to earth. And they're said to be drops of blood. But in a way, semen and blood and milk are really all the same thing, because it's just a very, very subtle change that produces the two of them. It's a common stuff. You might say it is the creme de la creme that comes from the nucleus of the creative cell rather than from the plasma. But it's really important. The two drops of blood become Hu and Sa. And they are taste and feeling. I assume that the Hu is the more earthy quality, more associated with Tefnut, and Sa or Say is the more rare quality that is associated with Shu. This is exceedingly important because it describes actually what happens in the process of creation or generation or emanation, any of these states. It isn't something that is done fully in the blind. There is a quality that at the process, at the same time that something is generated, so also is the ability to perceive that generation. And it is a self-checking process. You watch as you bring something into creation. If you draw, you're watching yourself draw. If you play music, you're listening to yourself play music. So the creation and the feedback of the creation are produced simultaneously. The realm that is precipitated or created or generated and the perceptive ability to know that realm are created at the same time, because they're coming, you might say, from the same core. And to try and jump ahead with the understanding of your creation without the perception of it is an exceedingly dangerous thing. So you look at all of the creation stories, the gods always look on their creation and they see it's good. And they take joy in it. And so that the whole process, it's all tied together. The perception, what is perceived, and the perceiver all happen simultaneously. Okay. Oh, this is going along real fast. We might be done in an hour and a half. This brings us to the next couple, Seb and Nut. Seb is sometimes called Geb, and sometimes called Keb, depending on how far back you go in history. Geb, I guess, is the oldest. I'm not certain about that. Again, they are elemental. They don't have a nome. They don't have a city. They are always everywhere revered throughout Egypt. And like Shu and Tefnut, Seb and Nut have a special temple or a special part of the temple of Hathor at Dendera. Meaning to say that where the great big zodiac is, we might even bring out the Egyptian zodiac next time. I don't know which one to get, because there's one in the stacks at the university. I've only seen one. It's the only place I've ever seen it. It's a 10-sign zodiac. And so, I don't know if I can get in there to dig that out. I don't even know if it exists there anymore. There's just so many great books that have been, they go by the wayside. But they have no city, but they all have a special elemental part of the temple, meaning to say that the zodiac has the 4 elements within it. They represent, again, generative divinities. They produce the conditions for journeyman creators like us and the angels and such like that to grow in. This is a general principle of hierarchy, that the higher on the ladder that you climb, the more generalized is your function, and the more your intelligence is passed down as the stuff for other beings to create within. That you can't, if you become spiritually and creatively unfolded, whether you're backing in the way we are backing into matter, or whether you're rising up, you can no longer use your intelligence to be piddling around doing little handiwork. Your intelligence becomes more universal. The higher up on the ladder you are, the further you can see. And that is the holding of that higher, more rare kind of consciousness makes available the element, or makes available the atmosphere for other people to create. And our job changes as we unfold spiritually. Seb is a little bit more particular than Shu or Tefnut or Nut, because Seb is literally the earth. That's the way the Egyptians would state it. They would stamp their foot on the ground and say that they literally walk on the body of Seb. Interestingly enough, if we remember, Nut represented the earth, as does Seb represent the earth. It is very important in terms of hierarchies, as a principle we're going to come back to the next time we meet, which will be 2 weeks from tonight. It will not be 1 week, it will be 2 weeks from tonight. Every realm is balanced. There is a male element and there is a female element. And this is an exceedingly important point of view to have, or it is an exceedingly important principle, that anything that we experience in any realm, in any element, in any state of our being, it's important to examine and experience it from at least an active and a passive point of view, a receptive or a directive point of view. Without such a balance, you are seeing only illusion. You either have Platonistic invisible lightus, or you have materialistic formal illusion, where you think the form is the reality and is the meaning. The Egyptian hierarchy, the Egyptian stratification of the different realms is most explicit and wonderfully balanced in that every element has both a male and a female member to it. Shu is most especially, Seb is most especially known as the god of the surface, or sometimes as the god of leaves. If we remember, Nupt was called the black-skinned daughter of Nu, actually through Nut. And we said when we were looking at the material feminine that this represented the absolute density as opposed to the absolute rarity of the absolute. And this absolute density is so dense that one can only, it's the end of the line, one can only see the surface. So it is both the end of the line as far as the dip into matter, and it is the end of the line as far as externalization, so that we can only go so far and then we turn around and come back. This brings out an extremely important principle. Again, this is just filled with principles in here that we could spend a whole night on each one alone, and that is the principle of the skin or of the surface. On one hand, we know, how does they say it? Beauty is only skin deep, and that you can't tell a book by its cover. We see that if you have only the surface and you can't see through it or you can't see behind it, we have what is called evil. And Seb, like Nupt, was sometimes, matter was considered, or earth was considered evil. And Seb was considered an evil man. He was considered the old evil one, which is really quite interesting because of the illusionary nature. But the skin is where everything gets done, because everything is at its height of limitations. You may say Seb and Nupt represent the height of limitation and particularization. If you look at a cell, all of the work of the cell's experiencing of the world takes place at the skin. All of the stuff in an apple, or especially in a potato, is at the skin. All of the objective creative work is done at the skin. So the skin, as well as being a place of illusion because of its extreme impenetrability and its extreme materialization and particularization, is also the only place that we can experience things in discrete objective experiences that are so separated that they don't even seem like they belong to the same reality. So the skin is where everything gets done. I don't know how to say it any other way. The whole character of someone is actually also written in their skin. So, Seb was associated with most of the activity at the skin of the earth, tilling and things like that. He was called the Lord of the bread and cakes of the gods. Egyptians were really big on cakes. They liked cake a lot. And it's interesting to note in this that pictures of Seb, he's usually lying down. He's almost always lying down. And usually he's lying down with his arms spread out. And I think he's laying on his right side because he draws his essential nature from having his right arm in the earth. And his left arm, he draws a spiritual energy from the sunlight. He receives the creative energy from the sunlight. The reason he's lying down, because that is the nature of the skin. The skin represents the ultimate horizontal. We're going to talk about this next time. Represents the ultimate horizontal. And the horizontal, as opposed to the vertical, the horizontal, like our horizon, is the receptive plane. Everything is equal on the horizontal. On the vertical, everything is hierarchical. Now, if Seb is laying on his side, you might say that's anti-hierarchical. This is another reason why Seb is called evil. That to stay on one plane, or to stay uniplanar, especially to stay on the earth plane, is to be considered evil, which is the state of almost all humanity now. We're almost exclusively in materialism, and we are anti-hierarchical because all of the things that would be hierarchically evaluated are all matter. Even our thoughts, according to the modern physiologists, are different combinations of matter. In neural networks and things like that. It's still all materialism. Now we come to a little bit of comparative mythology, because Egyptian mythology not only had a big influence on Babylonian and on Hebrew mythology, especially on Hebrew mythology because of the exile of the Hebrews into Egypt, where they picked up quite a few things. But the Greeks, a lot of the Greeks went to Egypt to be initiated. And in this sense, we'll start making some other pictures on the board. You'll see now, this is a big explanation for a lot of astrology and for a lot of mythology, and a lot of things will come home just as soon as I put two words on the board. Who is the most evil one? Saturn or Kronos. Who rules the earth? Who rules the ultimate of particularization? Who represents the resistible qualities? All of these things are Saturnine things. In this regard, laying on his side and having one arm into the earth or the underworld and one arm into heaven, Nut was called the door. Seb is called the porter or the gatekeeper. He's the gatekeeper. In one sense, the Tuat represents the physical earth. In another sense, it represents the underworld, the realm of the dead that is behind it. So there is a positive side and a negative side. It also represents that on which the ladder of souls stands. So the quality of being faithful to the earth. Because what do we say? We say that if a drawing, we say that it is a faithful representation. And Seb, or Kronos, or Saturn, whatever name we want to call it by, represents faithfulness. And to the degree that we faithfully represent and perceive and experience the material world, to that degree are we freed. Then Seb will open the door to us to the gate. But the gate to the ladder of the stars. Either in going into the underworld as the initiate does, or in going to the heaven worlds in the ladder of the stars. Even before you can enter into the spiritual realms, this again goes back to Baudet's law, from the sun going out, before you can get to the transcendental planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, you have to get past Saturn, which is the first thing when you start leaving the Earth. When you first leave the Earth, the first thing you have to do is overcome your biological nature, which is the moon. The last thing that you overcome before you enter the realm of the gods is destiny itself. You can't get at the good meat of the universal love or the higher spiritual consciousness represented by Uranus and Neptune until you can rise above destiny and not think of things in a selfish way. So Seb represents the gate man, and he was always the gate man when you entered into the Tuat, either daily when you went on the Matet boat with Ray into the underworld. The gatekeeper was always Seb. Interestingly enough, Seb did two things. He either freed the righteous so that they could go up into heaven, meaning to say that if we were faithful and lived through the proving ground, because that's what this is the proving ground, Seb then freed us. If we took the earth for all it was worth. However, if we hung on to the illusion and became exceedingly selfish, exceedingly wicked, then Seb was the one that bound up the earthbound, literally. So to be tied to the earth in such a way that we didn't take at the earth as an experience to appreciate to its fullest, but tried to grasp onto it and hold it, we were then bound by Seb and tied into it. That's a principle that is in itself very, very big. Like Kronos, Seb was also associated with time and history. If we look at it, the earth is our best record we have of history. If we look at all of the fossil remains that are in it, and even the stuff itself, like if we take atomic time and half-lives and things like that, that is all measured by the earth itself. We're going to talk more about that next year. But even the physical body is ruled by Seb, because the physical body that we have and the way we live in it and the ability we have to work in it represents the sum total of all of our formal experience in all the periods. Saturn, Sun, Moon, Earth, all the total experience that we have of form is historically deposited and carried along in living fashion in our physical body. So it's no surprise at all that Seb would be associated with time and history. Together with Nut, Seb was associated, but mostly Seb, with the Akiru lions. Geez, I missed some things about Shu and Tefnut, about the pair of green-faced lions, but I'll just have to pass on that. We'll have to miss it and say that there's a whole bunch of things. We're not even going to get to the Book of the Dead, Egyptian Book of the Dead, in this, after spending all this time. I've got about 5 volumes of Osiris that I would like to dig through and bring all sorts of things out of them. We're just not going to have time to do any of that. The Akiru lions were called Seth and Tual. And they were of yesterday and tomorrow. These were lions that were like Janus-like. They had 2 faces. They were lions' bodies, and they had 2 faces. And Seth pointed to the east. The Seth face pointed to the east, and the Tual face pointed to the west. Saying, this is a flip side. Again, I don't want to get too much into it. So we have, again, the whole experience of time. Looking backward in time, which Saturn does very well. It looks back historically at the mistakes it may have made, and it looks forward to the potentialities that might be there. Afterthought and forethought are both qualities of Saturn. The lions being solar beings, the sun being the focus of time for everything in our realm, that the sun represented the sphere of time, the momental time, so that in the momental time, the more deeply we go into the moment, the more we can see into yesterday, and the more we can see into tomorrow, which experiences mostly like memory. We won't go into that because I'm going to try and get this done in 90 minutes. Oh, do you know I did this all wrong? Okay, all my pages smoothed up here. So we're going to have to go up to Newt and then come back to Seb. I don't know how I ever got those things all in that order. Oh, we're in big trouble here. Let's look a little bit at Newt. I thought I covered Newt before I covered Seb. Newt, if Seb is earth, Newt is heaven. We say everything between heaven and earth. Oh, as long as I do this right. That's why everything. Do you wanna? This is really going to be mixed up in order, but that's all right. I couldn't figure where I was in my notes, but we're still back at Shu. Shu was the lord of the birds. And the birds were the thoughts. In the same way that Shu represented the air, the birds represented the thoughts. This is just the opposite, going the opposite way, in the same way that the feather represented the invisible air. The air, in order to experience or communicate with the other elements, had to condense the birds. So we have then the macrocosm of Shu and the microcosm of Shu in the atmosphere in the birds. So we have Shu as a lord of light, dry, empty space. He had a complete Scorpio scepter. It had a scorpion, a serpent, and a hawk on it. And, okay, that's enough on that. Shu and Tefnut were known as the twin lions. She was green-faced, he was red-faced. And among the other things of Shu and Tefnut, they were the parents of said Seb and Nut. Now we're getting to where we want to be. A few more pages and we'll be back in order again. Now, we already mentioned that Nut was the wife of Nu, but that doesn't make any difference. She can also be the wife of Seb. No difficulty with that at all. Nut is pictured in many, many ways, but she's always associated with heaven. And she always has a black body, and almost always, sometimes she's pictured as a cow with 16 paps, but usually is pictured as being in a human-like body that's black and star-spangled. She is heaven. In this sense, she represents the proto-state, with Nu, if he represents the inert mass of water, that means ice. The space of the abyss in which the ice forms is what Nut represents. So she is that transitional state. This is a similar space that she has with Seb. Everything happens between heaven and earth. This is a very sexual story. The story is said that it doesn't say how Seb and Nut were generated by Shu and Tefnut. It doesn't at all say that. It just says that they are the children of. But Seb and Nut were locked in embrace. And what happened is that Shu insinuated himself in between them, and he raised Nut up above Seb. She's always over Seb. She then represents a different kind of water than Tefnut does. Tefnut represents spit, or she represents precipitate water. Nut represents the principle of evaporation, where air, hot, dry air, lifts water up, and in this sense lifts the heavens from the earth, or pushes the earth away from the heaven. And he held her separated from the mutual embrace with Seb. So this represents, Nut represents not only evaporation, but she represents like an assimilation. And she represents like a distillation. And so Nut and Tefnut represent the cyclicity of water. Tefnut representing precipitation that brings life from the spirit down into matter, and Nut represents water that is being absorbed and taken up into heaven as assimilated experience, and it is done so by the dry air so that it becomes impersonalized, and it represents the kind of soul material that is taken out of manifest existence. So Shu is both a precipitator. The mind of Shu is a precipitator of feeling, but the mind is also an abstractor. In both cases, it is associated with feeling. So this is the whole, you might say, the evaporation process. If you look at this, the whole quality of Shu being hot and dry, and of Tefnut being cool and moist, and looking at Nut as an evaporative process, this takes us directly into alchemy. Since we're talking about perception and things that are born out of perception, meaning to say that the perception is born at the same time as what is perceived is born, this is the most important experiences that we can do. Now, this is going to sound almost like people taking acid trips. People used to take acid trips and they would put water in their hand and they would feel the liquidity of the water, and they could do this for hours on end. Truly, this is what the alchemists did. They precipitated things, they fired things, they dried things, they evaporated things. If we perceive the processes of nature, even in the three-dimensional realm that we are in, as closely as we can get to the elemental spiritual principles that are behind. We can unfold an understanding of everything that works inside of us. Our bodies are not just functional, to digest food and things like. All of those things are vital for our continued existence here, but all of the processes that take place inside of our body are actually materializations of spiritual principles. And whether we know it or not, we especially know it when we become ill or when things don't function correctly in our bodies. But when we focus on our physiological activity and are aware of what we're doing and assist it, like drinking a lot of water if we have a tendency to not filter correctly, doing all of those kinds of things, and watching these things in ourselves and in nature is the way we unfold spiritually, because we then bring out the spiritual functions inside of us. Now, this separation of Seb and Nut by Shu was driven by Re. So this very clearly shows that Re is behind it all. And the whole process was watched by Tehuti, meaning to say that the intellect was behind it all. Okay. Another thing that we can look at with Shu being between Seb and Nut, Shu was considered the first offspring of Tem, and therefore was the first of the progenitors of divine kings. And if Shu represents air or intellect between the spirit and matter, or between heaven and earth, it is saying that the divine kings were born, were word-born, were air-born, were born of the intellect. And this goes very much along with the line of the Mercurial mysteries. That is, that the Mercurians brought about the mysteries, and to evolve within the mysteries means to develop the mind to get within the core or the nucleus of all mysteries at the heart of them. All right. We're getting back just about caught up to where we are supposed to be. The why shall be captured in their folly. I had this really laid out for a smooth transition from one space to another, but then I just missed my notes up. All right. Nut is considered the cover of heaven, or the protector. She's also seen as a divine feminine and as a divine mother, and she was the apotheosis of the earthly feminine. She was the uplifted woman. She is sort of like the Mary Magdalene, raised to a spiritual sense through being evaporate. And in that state having been removed from all of the material qualities, all of the evil qualities of earth itself. For this reason, she represents the higher water, and almost all the pictures of Nut as a human-like, she has a jug of water on her head. And so she has all of the qualities of the redeemed woman. She has poise, and she has receptivity, she has a retaining type of quality, and she has all of this assimilate matter that she holds or suspends above earth. But the water is also spent. She is, for example, in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, she pours the water out to cleanse the dead souls, and she does cleansing for any soul that asks her. She sprinkles water, the water of libation, and she also has the water of fertility, meaning to say that the water that comes back down and precipitated from heaven is, how would you say it, irradiated with spirituality. So in this heavenly sense, she's called the Great Lady of Re, and she's considered the Mother of Day, because she's pictured bent over on the two mountains, Baku and Manu, and so she becomes literally the mother of the gods as they go through heaven. It's getting hot in here, isn't it? Yeah, I'm sorry. Oftentimes, she's pictured as bent over under Shu, or over Shu. Shu holds her up. And with that, her arms and legs become associated with the pillars of Shu. And I don't know how to say what I'm going to have to say. The arms and legs of Nu become the fundamental principles of the qualities of the four elements in psychology. The arms and legs of Shu, since Shu is the airy element that lifts up the heavens, they represent the four corners of the square of logic. But when the square of logic has the feeling of Nut behind it, the uplifted feeling of Nut or heaven behind it, it becomes like a psychological understanding, and the four corners of the square of logic become the four corners of a square of logic. Sometimes in this position, she's pictured, instead of having stars all over her body, she's pictured as a cow, and she has 16 caps from which all of the gods or all of the races of humans are nurtured by heaven. Sometimes the arms and legs are pictured as trees. Again, we have, you remember the poles, one going, the Shu being. Unfortunately, I could find nowhere what all of the four trees that represent the arms and legs of the bent-over Nut are. The only two I could find were the balsam tree and most particularly the sycamore tree. She is the goddess of the sycamore tree, and most especially was she associated with that tree. If you remember, when we talked last year about Siegfried, remember the tree that went through the corner, Sigmund, went through the corner of the house of Hunding, and Odysseus had his wedding bed. The leg of the wedding bed was a tree that ran through the whole castle. This is again the spirit matter tree from which we are all offshoots. And it brings up a whole lot of other things, which I can't really go into. I'm going to go into some a little bit because it may be a little long. Isis, she had 4 children. Sometimes they say 5, but we won't go into the reasons why. And these are the 4 children: Osiris, Isis, Set, Nephthys, and sometimes Heru.
You said that's the children of Isis?
No, Osiris, Isis, Nephthys, Set, and Heru are the children of Nut. And therefore Isis was her daughter. And Isis in many cases becomes synonymous, because Isis is brown-skinned, becomes synonymous with Nut, the brown-skinned one. And it's really interesting that she takes and Isis takes and puts Horus into the trunk of the sycamore tree. And according to the same myth, Mary took Jesus and hid him from who were they fleeing? My memory is Herod. Hid him from Herod by putting him in the sycamore tree. This represents a state of spiritual development where the consciousness is turned inward to its progenerative consciousness, or its progenerative source, instead of being externalized and made vulnerable. Oh boy. Isis who could not be unveiled. Isis is synonymous with Nut. That again represents the skin that can't be penetrated. Isis cannot be unveiled because it is the end of the line and everything is so externalized. I guess I'm going to skip on some of these things, but I want to bring out one little story. All of the children of Nut were born in different places. And they were born on different days. In the first day, Osiris was born. In the second day, Horus was born. In the third day, Set was born. In the fourth day, Isis was born. And in the fifth day, Nephthys was born. Oh boy. These days were considered good and bad. These days were considered bad. These days were considered good. I'm taking a little side trip. The Egyptians were mathematical, and they had their calendar year being 360 days long, so that each day represented 1 degree of the zodiac. That left 5 days left over, and those 5 days were given. They're called what are they called? Epigamial. Epagamial. Epigamial days. They're intercalary days. We talked about them when we talked about Isis, Osiris, and Horus 2 years ago, was it, or something like that, 3 years ago. We talked about the dice game where they took so many hours off of a day and that they made the 5 days that belonged to the 5 principal or closest gods to the humans, and they gave them their special days. So they went through the 360 days of the year, and then they had the 5 epigamial days, and in those 5 epigamial days, they did all kinds of celebrating. And all right, all of the children of Nut were born in different places, and they were all born on different days, meaning to say that they represent a dispersion. They represent, this is sort of elementation carried even further. She was often pictured with either a vulture or a serpent crown, and she was sometimes pictured as snake-headed. And this shows the hot water of Scorpio being Mars and Pluto, Mars being evaporating it, and it represented the water of Nut in the evaporative state represented regenerative water. She was called the mistress of two lands, being of the water above and the water below. I don't think I want to cover anything more. And she's always arched over Seb. I don't know whether this has anything to say about the over Seb. Under Shu, over Shu holds her up, but she's always over Seb, who is her brother and husband. And I don't know whether this has something to say about the sexual preferences of Egyptians or not, whether they liked the woman to be on top or that sort of thing. It does have something to say about the culture of magic and the culture of how things are evaluated. That as far as magic was concerned, the reflective quality is the quality that they used for all their magical practices, but we can't go into that because that's too long to go into. I'm sorry, I should have made this 2 talks, but all right. But at any rate, when she's bent over, we see Seb underneath her, and we've talked a little bit about that. Now we're back at where we were with Seb. We've looked at him as the evil man, as Janus, and as all of that. But Seb also has some other qualities. Seb always wore the white crown, and the white crown was the crown of the north. The red crown was the crown of the south. And the red crown was associated with the hot equatorial areas, and the white crown was associated with coolness of the north. And obviously, in the ladder of stars, Seb or Saturn, if the moon would be at the equator, Seb or Saturn would be at the polar regions, and we've talked about that when we talked about Hamlet's Mill. That we can take the ladder of the stars and put it on the Earth from the equator going up, and then we have Saturn right at the pole, and the magnetic field then becomes Uranus, and the interplanetary ocean becomes Neptune, and the primum mobile becomes Pluto, but we don't have to go into all of that. All right. Seb was also associated with the goose. And in this sense, this takes us right back again to the Hindu mythology. Remember the Kali Hansa, the black swan or the black goose that laid the golden egg that represented the light space being born out of black space. This is shows again the quality of the porter. Even the cosmos was born out of the egg of Seb. Okay. This, if the ladder of the stars is laid on the earth, and it is Christ's cross, both Herod and Caiaphas represent the porter at the earth. Seb is the earth at the beginning of things, and before we can get out to the outer heavens in a reflective way, Seb represents the porter to the spiritual worlds. So the 2 dark, restrictive figures that threaten the life of Christ Jesus at the beginning and at the end of the story are both Seb figures, and they both show the reflection of it all in time.
Is Candace still on the spirit?
The high priest. The high priest that had the Romans do the dirty work. He said it was the Roman law, but it was Sanhedrin that actually wanted it done, but they didn't want to be personally involved or directly involved. Now, very interesting things. Affectionately, the Greeks called Seb the Great Cackler. They called him the Great Cackler because Seb in Nut laid the great egg. This goes back again to the Saturn period. And out of this great egg is where the sun god sprang. And the sun god sprang as a phoenix. And the egg that the great cackler laid was put in a worm's nest, which is sort of like the Orphic serpent surrounding the egg. And the worms represented an in-the-dark, underground, surrounding spiral wisdom. And they hatched the egg. And when the soul of the sun god, we know that Re was the sun god, the soul or the double of Re that was regenerated was called Bennu. And Bennu was a phoenix that had red and gold feathers that came from the east. Again, they were looking to the east, looking for the new sun to be rising. And Bennu was the light before and after the visible light. That is the spiritual light. Now, it's interesting to note that there are 3 distinctly different times that they think that the phoenix rises. They think it comes every 500 years, or every 1461 years, or 7,006 years. Interesting numbers, aren't they? Well, here we have the Ennead in the 9-pout. With the invisible member, whether it be the down invisible member or whether it be the up invisible member, it represents the Io number, the 10, the decad. So 10s are always involved. So, taking 500 and dividing it by 10, we run into 50. This is not the 50-year cycle or the 50 new moons repeating. This is something else. The Egyptians were very much associated with the star of Isis, which was called Sothis, and which we know as Sirius. Sirius is actually a double star, and only in East Africa, including those very primitive people that live in mud huts called the Dogons, they know that the twin star of Sirius or Sothis or the star of Isis, that the twin star has a period of 50 years. And 10, 50 years would be 500, would be a complete regeneration of the spirit. The other one, this is hypothetical on my part. This one is very well known, the 1461. The reason for it was, we erased what we weren't supposed to erase. The Egyptians were very stubborn about having a 365-day year. Even though every 4th year they should have put in a leap year, this is what got us in the Western world in trouble. Because we never put in the leap year until the Gregorian calendar was developed. And Easter was getting further and further away. The Egyptians knew all about that. They had their 360-day year, and then they had their 5 epigamial days, and they didn't care if every 4 years they lost a day. Every 4 years they lost a day, and that would mean every 120 years they would have lost a month. that is 30 days. And that would mean every 1460 years, they would have lost a year. And therefore, in 1461 years represented, there was a phoenix in that the whole calendar, according to the heliacal rising of Sothis, relative to the first day of spring, was regenerated. So this is when the phoenix came, was once every 1461. It meant that the solar year, or that is the Earth relative to the sun, was again lined up with the whole of the stars every 1461 years. This one, I don't know, it's all speculative, but that's about the year that Nostradamus says that the Earth goes up into an etheric flame and the phoenix rises back into the etheric realm. But I don't know that they would know that in Greece. That's the only thing. I don't know anything about that number, and I've not been able to reference it anywhere, and I haven't sat down with a calculator for a long time to find out the relationship of it. The first thing I would look at is the relationship of 1461 to 7006, but I don't know that. Okay. We have already said that Seb and Nut were the parents to Isis, Osiris, Set, Nephthys, and Horus, either directly or indirectly. Now, this brings us to some things that I want you to contemplate over the summer, because when we get to Greece, we're going to go into them. This is Earth. All right. Precip is Tefnut. Evaporate is Nut. Frozen is Nu. Or this is ice. This is running water. That is fluid, liquid water. Air is Shu. The same thing as Uranus. All right. Ray is fire. So here we have the generation of the elements, from Re through Shu to Seb through Cyrus. Just contemplate these in terms of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Helios, or the original sun before there was a precipitation of planets, and look at the order of the elements. I want to talk about one more thing. Seb and Nut shut up Osiris, meaning to say, were shut up by Osiris. When Osiris took over as king, he locked up Seb and Nut. And this took place on the same day as the mutilation, which is said to be a self-mutilation. Not only was Re a masturbator, but he was a self-mutilator. So relative to the castration of Uranus and the self-castration of Helios, those are the topics I'd like you to think on over the summer, because they're the ones that I'm going to be thinking on over the summer. I already have a number of ideas on them because they relate to hierarchy, and that's as far as we're going to go tonight. I'm sorry that I got things all confused and things didn't flow out in the right order that they were supposed to flow out in, but I think you have some of the basic ideas about the generation of the gods in the elemental sense in the Egyptian hierarchy. Next time we are going to talk about Osiris and Isis, very little, some about Set and Nephthys. I don't think we're going to talk anything about Horus, and then we're going to talk about hierarchy per se and some of the principles involved in it that are we've already been, if you notice, we actually even mentioned the word hierarchy a number of times tonight. We're actually getting to our topic. I didn't abstract out all of the principles. I normally try to do that in notes. I try to put them in a special color so that I can later on pick them out and have all the principles of hierarchy that we've picked out over the year. But we'll be a little bit Babylonian about it and chaotic rather than hierarchical and Egyptian. And that's about it for tonight. Questions?
Is Set, S-E-T, sometimes spelled S-E-T-H?
That is this, yes.
What was, I don't know along that time, was he something like a god of the underworld or something?
No, he was the god of what we would call nature. He was the masculine of what we would call nature. Yes. And the constant battle that takes place between Heru and Set is like the battle that takes place between Abel and Cain. And it is a continuous battle. If Heru represents the sun or the intelligent light, and Set represents nature or a dark, shadowy kind of figure, the struggle between Horus and Set is the struggle of spiritual intelligence with the cunning resistance of nature. Every time Heru wins, he kills Set. But he is rejuvenated time and time again by Isis. She brings him back from the dead, meaning to say that the virgin principle constantly is bringing more out of the absolute as an adversarial strength. And the killing of Set by Heru or by Horus means the death of the instinctual quality of the frozen ignorance in nature that is killed by becoming known by the light of the sun penetrating through it and seeing it. There's another perfectly good interpretation for that, and it goes right along the lines of what we were talking about tonight, and that is when the spiritual light becomes live, when the sun becomes the sun, it does so by throwing off everything that it isn't or that it isn't yet, that is becoming. And the further off it is thrown, and nature is about as far off as you can get, the further off it is thrown, the more it is put into slow motion, and the more it is apparently dead. But it is that stopped action quality of nature that makes it possible for Horus to feed on it, and makes it, like all of the stories of the battle between Horus and Set. Horus is always throwing spears at Set, and that means projection of spiritual intelligence into that stopped action so that it can be understood. And it's sort of like, things are going too fast, I've got to slow them down. And the more I can kill them or bring them to a stopped state, the more objectively I can see them. It's very much like what takes place in a concentration. It's like the spirit wakes up and becomes exceedingly vibrant and alive to the extent that you can hold the concentration to a nearly stopped state. I don't believe it's possible to completely stop a concentration so that something stands dead still. I just don't believe that's possible. Either that, or I'm very, very far away from being a good concentrator. But that's the kind. See, you already brought out what we were not going to have a chance to discuss. We weren't going to do anything with Hebrew at all.
Is it a coincidence? Maybe it's just like said in the Bible?
No, it's not a coincidence. Yes, a lot of these things are Hebrew things are borrowed from the Egyptians. They're either borrowed from the Egyptians or from the Chaldeans during the Babylonian exile, or from the Greeks. Rudolf Steiner has a notion, and I believe that it's right. This is an expansion of Steiner's notion, that one of the works of the Hebrew people was to maintain an exoteric and a thoroughgoing esoteric and exoteric monotheism. But in concentrating all of their energy into that, they couldn't develop the multi-flavored, the rainbow qualities that the polytheistic nations did, which specialized. Some were of a Mars ray and some were of a Venus ray, but they all had rainbow cultures, even though they specialized on one color. And because the Hebrews specialized in the monotheism, but still needed the effect of the rainbow, they had to assimilate it from other cultures. And this is what happened in the various different exiles, the Egyptian exile, the Babylonian exile, the being taken over by the Greeks and being taken over by the Romans. And this kept that culture as vital as could be kept. And finally, Steiner goes so far as to say that they had no real school of initiation among the Hebrews, and so this is why they had prophets instead. And he goes so far as to say that the prophets were incarnations of initiates from other mystery schools in other cultures. Like Moses, he claims, was one of the two disciples of, I believe Hermes Trismegistus and Moses were together the two choice disciples of Thoth in a much earlier Egyptian time, and that Moses was chosen to be born as a prophet to the Hebrews because he had just the qualities from Egypt that they needed to bring them out of Egypt and such. We should have all just questions. It would probably be a much more interesting. I'm really sorry because I worked so hard on these notes. I put in many, many hours, and they flowed really nicely into each other, and I jumbled the pages. Oh. Yes. Well, I would prefer to say the wise guys shall be captured in their folly. No questions, Dan?
You feel tired.
No, go ahead. No, I don't have to go to work tomorrow. I have to get up at 6 and get a load of carrots, but we got the tape running.
I'll get you next time.
Okay. Paul? Mark? No question. Dagmar? No. I'm in a good place for that tonight. Well, thank you very much.